History, in its selective wisdom, chooses certain names for remembrance and consigns others to oblivion. Marie Laveau stands as one such name inhabiting a liminal space revered in folklore yet conspicuously absent from scholarly texts. However, the individual who carried that name in the vast cotton fields of Mississippi was far removed from the New Orleans voodoo queen of legend. She embodied a threat far more profound to the prevailing order. It was a woman who grasped the potent truth that knowledge, painstakingly amassed and strategically applied, possessed the power to undermine the very bedrock of authority. What you are about to witness is not the watered-down narrative often presented in educational settings, nor the mystical spectacle peddled to tourists on Bourbon Street. This is the account deliberately suppressed from historical records, for it unveiled an inconvenient reality. The enslaved were not passive recipients of salvation, but the ingenious architects of their own liberation, wielding instruments far subtler than overt insurrection. And Marie Laveau, a slave from Mississippi whose authentic story was systematically buried, mastered these instruments with a precision that would irrevocably alter the destinies of countless individuals. The Natchez district of Mississippi, in the year 1839, was a realm where human beings and acreage constituted the measure of wealth. The mighty Mississippi River, a vital artery of commerce, coursed through the landscape, conveying cotton to the southern metropolis of New Orleans and funneling prosperity back upriver to the plantation owners who commanded thousands of acres of fertile bottomland. The Bumont plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of this rich soil, its heart a stately white-columned house, a symbol of the South's self-perception. Graceful, refined, and founded upon what they termed tradition, yet in actuality the product of the systematic subjugation of 247 souls compelled to generate that affluence. The plantation functioned as a miniature dominion, complete with its own internal economy, a rigid hierarchy of power, and meticulously crafted systems of reward and retribution. Presiding over this domain was the Bumont family. Charles Bumont, the patriarch, who had inherited the estate from his forebears, his wife Eleanor, who governed the household with an iron will concealed beneath silken gloves, their eldest son Thomas immersed in legal studies in Vicksburg with aspirations for a political career, their younger daughters being groomed for marriages of advantageous social standing, and a son still in his teenage years, destined to inherit the plantation. Beneath the family echelon resided the overseers and managers, men like Cyrus Holt, tasked with maximizing the productivity of the enslaved population while maintaining sufficient control to avert rebellion. Holt, a man in his 40s, lean and weathered, possessed eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for ruthlessness tempered only by pragmatic financial considerations. He recognized that damaged chattel diminished economic value, thus his punishments were carefully calculated to inflict pain without compromising labor capacity. At the base of this structure was the enslaved populace itself, segmented into strata reflecting the plantation's demands: house slaves tending to the main residence, field hands engaged in the labor-intensive process of cotton cultivation from planting to harvest, skilled artisans such as blacksmiths and carpenters, and individuals fulfilling specialized roles like midwives and healers. Into this rigidly structured existence arrived Marie Laveau on a Tuesday in March of 1839, her purchase at auction in Natchez costing $850. The auction transpired at the Forks of the Road, the second largest slave market in the South, where human beings were exhibited on platforms and subjected to scrutiny akin to livestock. Marie stood upon that platform, her gaze lowered, her posture conveying deference, as prospective buyers examined her teeth, hands, and overall physical condition. The bill of sale described her as healthy, literate, proficient in domestic management and the cultivation of herbs, approximately 23 years of age, with no known defects or vices. Her literacy, in particular, should have raised red flags. The education of slaves in reading was strictly prohibited in Mississippi, punishable by flogging for the slave and hefty fines for anyone providing instruction. However, Bumont's purchasing agent, a man named Dalton, who oversaw such transactions, perceived only an opportunity. A literate slave capable of maintaining inventory records for medicinal supplies and processing receipts for herb acquisitions would undoubtedly command a higher value than an illiterate one. What the bill of sale neglected to disclose was the origin of Marie's literacy, or the reason for her previous owners, a Louisiana planter named Rousseau, eagerness to divest himself of her despite her evident utility. No references were provided, no comprehensive history offered, and no explanation given for why a valuable, skilled slave would be sold at all. Dalton had inquired naturally, but Rousseau's representative remained deliberately vague, citing a downsizing of operations and a need for capital, the stock justifications that could easily be fabricated. The truth, unknown to Dalton and never divulged by Marie, was that Rousseau had sold her out of fear, not due to any overt act of defiance, violence, or insubordination, but because he had begun to observe an uncanny pattern of occurrences surrounding her. Accusations leveled against slaves would mysteriously dissipate. Punishments would be circumvented by circumstances that, while appearing coincidental, transpired with such frequency as to defy mere chance. Information that ought to have remained confidential would inexplicably surface among individuals who could leverage it to their advantage. Though Rousseau could offer no concrete proof of Marie's involvement in any of these events, he developed a superstitious dread of her nonetheless. Consequently, he had sold her, absorbing a financial loss on the price purely to remove her from his property, and had deliberately obscured her history to ensure the transaction's successful completion. Marie arrived at the Bumont plantation conveyed in the back of a wagon, her meager possessions contained within a cloth bundle. She was assigned to the cabin row situated behind the main house, a cluster of rudimentary wooden structures housing the domestic slaves. Each cabin accommodated 4 to 6 individuals, offering minimal privacy and even less comfort. Marie's cabin was marginally superior to those designated for field hands. It possessed a wooden floor instead of packed earth and a small window equipped with shutters. Nevertheless, it remained a considerable distance from anything remotely approaching comfort. She shared the cabin with 3 other women, Dinah, in her 40s, who managed the main house laundry and possessed an intimate, lifelong knowledge of the plantation's inner workings, Rachel, younger and more reserved, who worked in the kitchen and had a young child residing in the nursery cabin during her working hours, and Lily, approximately Marie's age, employed as a seamstress, crafting and repairing garments for both the enslaved population and, on occasion, for the Bumont family themselves. That inaugural night, Marie spoke little. With meticulous precision, she arranged her few belongings on the narrow shelf above her sleeping pallet, a small wooden box containing needles and thread, a cloth bundle of dried plants emitting a faint medicinal aroma, and a leather journal so worn that its cover had softened to the texture of fabric. The journal represented her most perilous possession, which she kept concealed within an oilcloth wrap at the very bottom of her belongings. "You can read?" Dinah inquired, observing Marie's handling of the journal. The question was posed with caution, almost a whisper, for literacy was a dangerous form of knowledge. Marie met her gaze steadily, assessing how much truth to reveal. "I can retain things," she stated carefully. recipes, remedies, lessons my grandmother imparted. At times I make notations to aid my memory, but I am uncertain if that constitutes reading. Her response was an indirect affirmation, implying literacy without a direct claim. Dinah recognized the intelligence behind this evasive maneuver. She nodded slowly. "It is best to be circumspect about what one knows and what one does not," she advised. "Hole does not favor slaves who are overly astute." "I shall bear that in mind," Marie replied, a promise she fully intended to keep. The following morning, Marie was presented to her primary supervisor, the plantation's head cook, a woman named Patience, who had served at Bumont for 30 years and wielded considerable authority within the domestic hierarchy. Patience, a woman of imposing stature in her 50s, bore hands calloused from decades of kitchen labor and eyes that assessed Marie with the same thoroughness Dalton had displayed at the auction, albeit for different objectives. "Do you possess knowledge of herbs?" Patience inquired, proceeding directly to the crux of the matter. "Yes, ma'am. My grandmother was a healer in Louisiana. She instructed me on which plants alleviate fever, which provide pain relief, and which can be fashioned into poultices for wounds. Can you cultivate them or merely utilize what is presently available?" "I can cultivate them." "I understand which plants thrive in sunlight, which require shade, which flourish in proximity to one another, and which do not." Patience nodded, apparently satisfied. "The herb garden behind the kitchen house has been neglected since old Martha's passing last year. No one else possesses sufficient botanical expertise to maintain it properly. That shall be your principal responsibility. Tend to the garden, prepare remedies when individuals fall ill. Keep meticulous records of your usage for supply accountability. You will also assist in the kitchen when additional hands are needed, particularly during the harvest season when we must feed extra laborers." She led Marie to the herb garden, which was, indeed, in a state of considerable disrepair. Weeds had encroached upon most of the beds, and the remaining plants appeared to be struggling. However, beneath the neglect, Marie could discern the foundational structure of a well-conceived garden. The layout was judicious, with taller plants positioned to provide afternoon shade for those requiring it, and a water barrel strategically placed to capture rainfall from the kitchen house roof. "I can make this work," Marie declared, her mind already formulating plans for the restoration, envisioning which plants to preserve, which to remove, and what new herbs to cultivate. "You will have the mornings to dedicate to the garden," Patience informed her. "In the afternoons, you will be available for medical consultations. Should anyone in the quarters be unwell, you will attend to them. In the evenings, you will assist in the kitchen. Sundays will be yours, except in cases of emergency." It was an arduous schedule, yet Marie had anticipated no less. The critical factor was that this work provided her with a legitimate pretext for traversing the plantation, for interacting with individuals across various operational spheres, for observing, listening, and accumulating intelligence. Over the ensuing weeks, Marie firmly established herself in her designated role. She tended the herb garden with methodical efficiency, diligently removing weeds, enriching the soil, and relocating struggling plants to more propitious locations. She commenced the cultivation of new herbs from seeds and cuttings she had brought with her: feverfew for headaches, comfrey for wounds, chamomile for digestive complaints, valerian for sleep disturbances, and willow bark for pain and fever relief. More significantly, however, she began to scrutinize the plantation's operations with the same meticulous attention she afforded her garden. She identified patterns in decision-making processes, the conduits through which information flowed within the hierarchy, the centers of concentrated power, and the areas where influence was diffused. She observed, for instance, that Cyrus Holt maintained exhaustive records within the plantation office. These ledgers documented every bushel of cotton harvested, every tool distributed, every punishment meted out, and every expenditure and profit generated. Those ledgers represented the operational nervous system of the plantation, and anyone who comprehended them would invariably grasp the entire system's mechanics. She noted that the Bumont family's youngest son, Thomas, had a propensity for leaving documents strewn about the library upon his return from legal studies in Vicksburg. He was careless with his papers, treating them as if they were invisible to the house slaves tasked with their cleaning, never contemplating that those slaves might possess literacy or comprehend the significance of the material they encountered. She observed that the house slaves who served at the dinner table frequently overheard conversations pertaining to business dealings, political alliances, financial obligations, and social commitments that the Bumonts deemed safe to discuss within earshot of individuals they considered invisible. Those conversations contained information that could prove invaluable to someone adept at its exploitation. She detected underlying tensions within the overseer hierarchy. Holt had 2 assistants who actively competed for his favor and for opportunities for advancement. This competition created fertile ground for manipulation, for pitting individuals against one another, and for controlling the dissemination or withholding of information from specific individuals. She recognized that the enslaved population itself maintained intricate social networks and hierarchies. There were individuals held in high esteem for their skills, those entrusted with confidences, and those who served as unofficial leaders within the quarters. Understanding these networks, she realized, would be paramount to achieving any objective. And she discerned that information, gathered judiciously and disseminated strategically, could fundamentally alter the balance of power in ways that overt force never could. Marie began to cultivate relationships with key individuals within the plantation's social fabric. She approached this endeavor with subtlety, never appearing overly eager, always maintaining an aura of helpfulness and keen observation, thereby gradually earning trust. With Dinina, who managed the laundry and thus had access to the main house, Marie shared remedies for the persistent arthritis afflicting Dinina's hands. In return, Dinina divulged observations regarding the Bumont family's routines, their emotional states, and their concerns. This exchange was not framed as clandestine intelligence gathering, but rather as the natural discourse of women who labored together and shared living quarters. With Patience, who oversaw the kitchen and was privy to much of the activity within the main house, Marie demonstrated unwavering reliability and skill, becoming an individual Patience could depend upon. Consequently, Patience began to confide in Marie with greater frequency, sharing insights into the plantation's operations, impending events, and the internal dynamics of the Bumont family. To the field hands, Marie offered medical care that surpassed the attention provided by the previous herbalist. She treated injuries and ailments with both skill and compassion, and in return, they started seeking her counsel, not only for physical ailments, but also for guidance on other personal challenges. Within 3 months of her arrival, Marie had firmly established herself as an individual of considerable worth, a trusted confidant, someone who observed and heard much, yet appeared to possess no agenda beyond the diligent execution of her duties. It was then that she commenced testing her nascent methods. The inaugural trial occurred in late April when a man named Samuel was accused of appropriating a ham from the smokehouse. Samuel, a field hand in his 30s, was a robust and capable individual, a husband to Grace and father to 2 young children. The accusation originated from one of Holt's assistants, a man named Briggs, a recent addition to the plantation, eager to prove his diligence. The evidence appeared incontrovertible. Samuel had been sighted in the vicinity of the smokehouse at an unusual hour late in the evening, after the cessation of the workday. Upon inventorying the smokehouse the following morning, a ham was found to be missing. A subsequent search of the quarters yielded the ham concealed within a cloth sack discovered near Samuel's cabin, buried beneath a loose floorboard. The prescribed punishment for theft was typically 20 lashes, administered publicly as a deterrent to the entire enslaved population, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of pilfering from the master. Occasionally, more severe penalties were imposed if the owner sought to make a particular example. Samuel vehemently maintained his innocence, swearing he had never taken the ham, never approached the smokehouse that evening, and had no comprehension of how the meat had come to be near his cabin. However, his word carried no weight against the tangible evidence and the testimony of an overseer's assistant. He was confined to the plantation jail, a small brick structure adjacent to the overseer's residence, to await his punishment, scheduled for the end of the week when the entire enslaved population would be assembled as spectators. Marie learned of this predicament on a Wednesday evening, when Grace, her eyes brimming with tears, sought her out at her cabin, pleading for assistance. "He did not do it," Grace insisted, her voice trembling. "Samuel would never steal. He understands the repercussions. He would not jeopardize himself, not with the children to consider. Someone is either lying or has made a grave error, but he did not do it." Marie listened attentively, posing probing questions. "Who witnessed him near the smokehouse?" "Briggs, the new assistant overseer. He stated he observed Samuel moving in that direction around dusk." "Did anyone else see him?" "No, only Briggs. And the ham was discovered near your cabin?" "Yes." "Buried beneath some loose boards behind the cabin, but anyone could have placed it there. We do not lock our cabins. No one does. Anyone could have concealed it there to implicate Samuel." Marie pondered this information with deep consideration. "Tell me about Briggs. What do you know of him?" Grace shook her head. "Not a great deal. He's only been here for a month. He arrived from somewhere in Alabama. Holt hired him to replace the assistant who departed. He is young, perhaps 25, and he is perpetually striving to impress Holt, constantly seeking out issues to resolve. Has he engaged in any specific conflicts with Samuel?" "Not to my knowledge. Samuel scarcely knows him." Marie filed this information away, her mind already engaged in exploring potential scenarios. "I shall endeavor to ascertain what I can learn," she assured Grace. "I cannot offer any guarantees, but I will make an effort." Over the ensuing day, Marie meticulously gathered information with unwavering precision. She conversed with individuals who worked in proximity to the smokehouse, casually inquiring about who had been present in the vicinity that evening. She spoke with residents of cabins near Samuel's, asking if they had observed anyone unusual in the area. She paid close attention to Briggs, observing his conduct, his interactions with other overseers, and his movements around the plantation. And she uncovered something noteworthy. Briggs had received a visitor the preceding week, a younger man, approximately 20 or 21 years of age, who had arrived on horseback and resided at the overseer's quarters for 2 nights. Several individuals had seen him, though no one knew his identity. He had departed early one morning, before most of the plantation's inhabitants were awake, heading in the direction of the road leading to Natchez. Marie also discovered that Briggs had been making minor errors in the plantation's record-keeping. While not significant enough to immediately raise alarms, these discrepancies suggested either incompetence or deliberate falsification. Cotton weights that did not precisely correspond. Tool inventories that were slightly inaccurate. Minor discrepancies that Holt had yet to detect, as Briggs was new and still familiarizing himself with the established systems. Furthermore, she uncovered an additional piece of information. Cyrus Holt's nephew, a young man named James, who resided in Vicksburg, had been actively seeking an overseer position on various plantations in the region. His efforts had thus far been unsuccessful, but he possessed considerable persistence and a reputation for willingness to undertake any task necessary to prove his worth. Marie began to formulate a hypothesis. What if the visitor had been James Holt? What if he had visited his uncle and during his stay had taken the ham, not for consumption, but as a gift from his uncle upon his departure? What if Briggs, aware of the missing ham and desperate to demonstrate his value to Holt, had opted to fabricate a culprit rather than admit his lack of knowledge regarding its disappearance? What if he had chosen Samuel simply because Samuel happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, passing by the smokehouse en route to another destination? It was speculative, but it aligned with the known facts. Crucially, it suggested a potential avenue for introducing doubt regarding Samuel's culpability. Marie understood that a direct confrontation with Briggs or Holt was untenable. She lacked the standing, the authority, and any meaningful voice within the plantation's established power structure. However, she possessed the capacity to strategically disseminate information, planting seeds that could germinate into questions posed by others. Her initial step involved patience. The following morning, while assisting in the kitchen, Marie casually remarked that she had been gathering herbs in the vicinity of the overseer's quarters the previous week and had observed a young man departing early one morning carrying an object wrapped in cloth. "Likely just a visitor," Patience commented, her interest seemingly minimal. "Presumably," Marie concurred, though upon reflection he bore a striking resemblance to Mr. Holt, the same build, the same gait. He could have been a relative. Patience's hands stilled in the bread dough she was kneading. Holt had a visitor. There was a sighting, unconfirmed, possibly of no consequence, but it sparked a contemplation. Individuals inherently inquisitive, especially one with a complicated regard for the overseer administration, started to ponder. This person casually broached the subject with Dinah that evening during what appeared to be ordinary discourse. Dinah, whose duties included the upkeep of the overseer's residence and who would have been privy to any overnight guests, confirmed the presence of a visitor for 2 nights the preceding week. "Did Hull mention this to Mr. Bumont?" inquired Patience. "Not that I recall," Danina replied. "But then why would he? People have callers frequently." "True," Patience conceded. Yet she found it peculiar that a guest would depart so early before the morning meal, almost as if in haste or seeking to avoid notice. This account began to disseminate through the domestic staff's informal communication channels, not as an indictment, but as a point of intrigue. As the household staff conversed with the Beaumont family members they served, the information eventually reached Elelana Beaumont, responsible for managing the estate's finances and possessing a keen intellect for discrepancies. Elelana shared this observation with her husband that evening, not as a significant matter, but as an unusual tidbit she'd encountered. "Did you know Cyrus had someone visit last week?" she asked. "His nephew, it seems, though he neglected to mention it." Charles Beaumont registered a slight frown. "He didn't inform me. He likely didn't deem it important, although the servant mentioned the young man departed very early before dawn." It struck me as peculiar. Beaumont, who held trust for his overseer but also valued his wife's intuition regarding domestic affairs, filed away this piece of information. The following day, he casually broached the subject with Holt, merely inquiring if his nephew had indeed paid a visit. Hall, taken by surprise, acknowledged that James had made a brief stop while en route to Natchez. He explained his omission by stating it seemed insignificant, merely a familial interaction unrelated to plantation operations. "Of course," Bumont responded, "though I do appreciate being aware of who is present on the property, purely for security considerations, you understand." "Naturally, sir, I should have communicated it. It will not recur." Nevertheless, the exchange had sown a subtle seed of doubt in Beaumont's mind. Why had Hull withheld this information? What else might be unmentioned? Meanwhile, Marie had been pursuing a separate avenue. She had observed minor inconsistencies in Briggs's record-keeping and had conveyed them with considerable circumspection to the plantation's bookkeeper, an elderly gentleman named Porter, who visited twice weekly for account reviews. Her disclosures occurred while she was attending to Porter's rheumatism, providing him with a poultice that offered significant pain relief. While applying the treatment, she had remarked, feigning confusion, that she had noticed figures in the Cotton House records that did not align with what she had overheard concerning harvest yields. "I am sure I merely misunderstood," she had stated. "I am not adept with numbers, but I thought I heard someone mention 42 bushels were picked, and the record indicates 40. I must have misheard." Porter, a man of meticulous accounting habits, made a mental note to scrutinize the Cotton House records more thoroughly. Upon his review, he discovered several minor discrepancies, none of them substantial, but sufficient to suggest either negligence or deliberate falsification. He reported these findings to Beaumont, who then questioned Holt. Holt, who had been unaware of these errors, was compelled to concede that his new assistant Briggs might indeed be making errors in the record-keeping. "He is still acquainting himself with the processes," Hull explained. "I shall provide him with closer supervision." However, this incident further eroded Briggs's credibility, adding another layer of doubt regarding his competence. Marie then played her final hand. She orchestrated a means for information regarding the smokehouse inventory's potential inaccuracy to reach Beaumont. This was achieved through an intricate chain of communication. She mentioned to Dinah that she had overheard a remark suggesting more than one ham might be missing. Dinah then relayed this to Elena Beaumont during laundry duties. Elena, in turn, conveyed it to her husband. Beaumont consequently ordered a comprehensive inventory of the smokehouse. The subsequent count revealed that 3 hams were indeed missing, not merely 1. The ham discovered near Samuel's cabin underwent a more thorough examination and was found to have been severed with a knife different from those issued to the enslaved population, a finer blade, the type a gentleman might possess. Suddenly, the case against Samuel appeared significantly less conclusive. If 3 hams were missing, and if the one found near his dwelling had been cut with an unfamiliar blade, then perhaps Samuel was not the culprit. It was conceivable that someone else had appropriated the hams, possibly Holt's nephew, as a clandestine gift from his uncle, and that Briggs, upon discovering the theft and perhaps disinclined to admit his ignorance of the matter, had framed Samuel by concealing one of the stolen items near his cabin. This was all conjecture, yet it introduced sufficient uncertainty to preclude Beaumont from proceeding with the punishment in good conscience. He ordered Samuel's release, citing insufficient evidence to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Samuel returned to his family, visibly shaken but unharmed. Briggs received a reprimand for his record-keeping errors and an admonition to exercise greater care in his accusations. Holt was instructed to apprise plantation management of any future visitors to his quarters, while Marie, who had masterfully orchestrated the entire sequence of events through astute observation and calculated discourse, continued tending her garden as if untouched by the proceedings. However, word disseminated through the enslaved community not through overt pronouncements, but via the subtle communication networks that connected individuals across the plantation. Within days, comprehension dawned that Marie Laveau was an individual who perceived matters others overlooked, understood the mechanics of authority, and possessed the ability to introduce minor pieces of information into that mechanism to alter its trajectory. They began to seek her out, not solely for herbal remedies, but for something more profound. The second case arose in June when a woman named Clara faced the prospect of being sold. Clara, a skilled seamstress in her late 20s, fashioned garments for both the enslaved populace and occasionally for the Bumont family. She had an 8-year-old daughter employed in the main house as an assistant to the cook. The threat of sale stemmed from Charles Beaumont's accumulation of debt incurred through a failed cotton speculation venture. He had heavily invested in cotton futures, anticipating a price surge, but instead, prices had declined, leaving him indebted to several creditors. One such creditor, a Louisiana plantation owner named Garrett, had offered to remit a portion of the debt in exchange for several enslaved individuals, including Clara. Garrett was widely reputed across the region as a cruel master. Accounts circulated of enslaved people sold to his plantation who perished within months due to overwork and mistreatment. Being transferred to Garrett was considered marginally preferable to being sold to the Deep South plantations, where conditions were even more dire. Clara sought Marie in a state of profound desperation. "They intend to sell me," she whispered, tears coursing down her face. "Mr. Beaumont has instructed Hall to prepare the paperwork for myself and 3 others. We are to be transferred to Garrett in Louisiana to settle a debt. My daughter will remain here. They will separate us. Please, Marie, I know you aided Samuel. I implore you, help me." Marie listened intently, her mind already engaged in dissecting the predicament. This situation presented a greater complexity than Samuel's case, directly involving the Beaumont family's financial affairs, not merely an overseer's error. The stakes were higher and the potential for failure more significant. "Relate all that you know concerning this debt," Marie requested. "What is Mr. Beaumont's obligation? When is the sale scheduled? What are your insights into Garrett?" Over the subsequent days, Marie meticulously gathered information from a multitude of sources. She ascertained that Beaumont owed Garrett approximately $3,000, a substantial sum. She learned the sale was slated for month's end, affording her less than 3 weeks to devise a resolution. She confirmed that Garrett's reputation for brutality was well earned and that he was also implicated in several dubious business dealings that had engendered animosity among other planters in the vicinity. Crucially, she discovered that Thomas Beaumont, the lawyer's son, had recently been retained to represent another planter, Whitfield, in a land dispute. Furthermore, Garrett was the opposing party in this legal matter. Thomas was, in essence, engaged in adversarial proceedings against Garrett, while his father negotiated the sale of enslaved individuals to the very same man. This presented Marie with the leverage she required. She commenced formulating a strategy designed to render the sale a source of social and professional discomfort for the Beaumont family. She understood she could not prevent the sale through direct intervention. She possessed no such authority. However, she could escalate the repercussions of proceeding with the sale, making its cost outweigh the benefit of settling the debt. Her initial objective was to ensure that information regarding the sale reached Thomas Beaumont, who might be unaware of his father's negotiations with Garrett. She accomplished this via the house slave network. Information flowed from Clara to Dina, then to the household butler, who casually mentioned it to Thomas during one of his visits home from Vicksburg. Thomas was indeed uninformed about the sale and expressed considerable disquietude. The prospect of selling enslaved individuals to a man against whom he was actively litigating created a conflict of interest that could jeopardize his professional standing. He voiced this concern to his father. However, Charles Bumont found himself in a precarious financial situation and perceived no viable alternative. The debt necessitated repayment, and Garrett's offer represented the most expedient solution. Marie needed to engineer an alternative, one more appealing than engaging with Garrett. She began to collect intelligence on Beaumont's other creditors and potential sources of capital that might enable him to discharge the debt without resorting to the sale of enslaved individuals. This necessitated accessing information typically well beyond her reach. She delved into financial records, business correspondence, and transactional details that were privy only to private conversations. She achieved this through a combination of keen observation and strategic inquiry. She absorbed conversations overheard by household staff. She perused documents Thomas occasionally left unattended in the library, reading them with alacrity. During her visits to deliver herbs to the main house, she engaged with enslaved individuals from other plantations who came to Bumont for various reasons, gleaning information about business dealings and financial circumstances across the region. In this manner, she uncovered a pivotal detail. Another planter, Prescott, whose estate lay approximately 20 miles distant, had recently acquired substantial capital through a land sale. Prescott was actively seeking investment prospects and harbored a long-standing rivalry with Garrett, making him inclined to oppose Garrett's interests whenever possible. Marie recognized she could not approach Prescott directly. As an enslaved person, he would dismiss any business proposition from her out of hand. However, she could ensure that information regarding Beaumont's financial predicaments reached Prescott through channels that would frame it as a commercial opportunity rather than a desperate plea. She executed this through a complex communication sequence. She remarked to a man named Peter, who served a merchant family in Natchez, that she had heard whispers of the Bumont family seeking alternative financing for certain business debts. Peter relayed this to his employers, who, in turn, mentioned it in casual discourse to other merchants. The information eventually reached Prescott through his own business network. Prescott, who was indeed seeking investment opportunities and harbored a disdain for Garrett, perceived a chance to both generate profit and undermine his rival. He approached Bumont with an offer. He would provide a loan under favorable terms to settle the debt owed to Garrett. In return, Bumont would grant him a share of the forthcoming cotton harvest and commit to utilizing Prescott's cotton broker for future sales. Bumont, recognizing an opportunity to resolve his debt without divesting enslaved individuals or dealing with Garrett, accepted the proposition. The sale was rescinded, and Clara remained at Bumont Plantation with her daughter. Clara never fully comprehended the extent of Marie's efforts to secure her freedom. She only knew that the sale had been cancelled, that she and her daughter would not be separated, and that inexplicably a favorable outcome had been achieved. However, others within the enslaved community began to grasp that Marie Laveau operated with a degree of sophistication far exceeding mere serendipity or chance. She manipulated the plantation's power structure with a precision that suggested a profound understanding of its intricacies, and they started to bring her increasingly complex predicaments. By the autumn of 1840, Marie had firmly established herself as a figure of understated authority within the quarters. Individuals sought her counsel not only for medicinal needs, but for guidance on seemingly insurmountable problems. There was a man whose wife faced the threat of sale to another plantation, a woman whose son had been falsely accused of damaging an expensive tool. A couple desiring marriage but anticipating the overseer's spiteful intervention due to the man's past challenge to his authority. Marie listened intently to each of them. She posed seemingly tangential questions. Who was present when the accusation was made? What other events transpired that day? What conversations had they overheard? What patterns had they observed in the overseer's behavior or the Bumont family's decisions? Then, with seemingly boundless patience, she would commence her work. She never acted directly, she never confronted those in power, never leveled accusations, and never exposed herself to undue risk. Instead, she would introduce information, much like sowing seeds in her garden, with careful precision in the appropriate soil at the opportune moment, and then patiently await its growth. Each intervention adhered to a discernible pattern. First, gather comprehensive information from multiple sources to understand the full context of the issue. Second, identify strategic leverage points, areas where minor pieces of information could instigate significant shifts in outcomes. Third, disseminate that information through trusted intermediaries who would relay it without comprehending its ultimate objective. Fourth, patiently observe the information's progression through the system to effect the desired change. Fifth, maintain an undetectable presence throughout the entire process, ensuring no trace of her involvement could be detected. This methodology demanded patience, intellect, and a profound understanding of human psychology and societal dynamics. Marie possessed all three. When a man named Joseph was accused of indolence and threatened with punishment, Marie discovered that the accusation originated from Briggs, the assistant overseer, who was still attempting to validate his worth following the Samuel incident. She also unearthed evidence that Briggs had been making errors in the cotton weight records, minor discrepancies suggestive of either incompetence or deliberate embezzlement. She subtly conveyed these discrepancies to the plantation bookkeeper during a visit for his rheumatism treatment, framing it as a naive confusion regarding figures she had encountered. The bookkeeper investigated, discovered the errors, and reported them to Bumont. Briggs was dismissed, and Joseph's alleged laziness was overshadowed by the more significant scandal of the falsified records. When a woman named Ruth found herself subjected to pressure from a visiting relative of the Bumont family, Marie unearthed information concerning the man's debts and gambling proclivities. She ensured this intelligence reached the man's wife through a circuitous route of gossip, presenting it as widely known rather than a deliberate disclosure. The wife confronted her husband, who departed the plantation in disgrace, and Ruth was thus protected. When a couple, Daniel and Esther, wished to marry but knew the overseer would thwart their union, Marie uncovered evidence that the overseer had been diverting plantation supplies for personal gain and selling them in Natchez. She facilitated the transmission of proof of this pilferage to Bumont via the bookkeeper. The overseer was dismissed, and his successor raised no objections to Daniel and Esther's marriage. Each intervention was subtle, almost imperceptible. Yet collectively they began to foster something more substantial, a perception among the enslaved populace that they were not entirely bereft of agency. That avenues for resistance existed that did not necessitate violence or flight. That information and strategic thinking could serve as potent weapons, rivaling any physical force. Marie ascended to legendary status within the quarters, albeit not through overt recognition. Individuals did not speak of her openly, nor did they attribute specific outcomes to her involvement, but they understood she was a source of aid, someone who discerned patterns others missed, someone adept at navigating the system to influence results. And that caliber of influence, even when exerted with subtlety, inevitably attracts hazardous scrutiny. Cyrus Hall was not an unintelligent man. His 15 years as an overseer across Mississippi and Louisiana had furnished him with the capacity to discern behavioral patterns in enslaved individuals that indicated potential unrest. He recognized the harbingers of rebellion, clandestine gatherings, hushed conversations that ceased upon his approach, unusual nocturnal movements, the concealment or fabrication of weaponry. However, Marie Laveau did not conform to any of these established profiles. She did not convene secret meetings, nor did she engage in conspiratorial whispers. She did not traverse the grounds at irregular hours, nor exhibit any inclination towards weaponry or escape. Her days were occupied with tending her garden, preparing her remedies, and conducting her duties with quiet efficiency. Yet events continued to unfold around her. Accusations faltered, punishments were circumvented, and his own authority was undermined in ways he could not definitively trace to a singular source. Upon closer examination, he observed that Marie seemed to be present at the periphery of many of these occurrences, not directly involved, yet somehow connected. By the summer of 1840, Hall had begun to observe Marie with increasing intensity. He lacked concrete proof. She was too discreet for that. However, suspicion does not necessitate validation, and Hall's suspicions intensified with each incident that appeared to resolve too conveniently for the enslaved population. He commenced his own inquiries. He consulted with other overseers, inquiring if they had noticed anything unusual regarding Marie. He monitored her movements, meticulously noting her destinations and her interactions. He endeavored to uncover evidence of malfeasance, such as concealed documents, secret meetings, or any material that would justify punitive action, but Marie had anticipated this. She had recognized from the outset that success would eventually attract attention, and she had prepared accordingly. She became even more meticulous, even more circumspect in her movements and conversations. She ceased intervening in situations where the risk was excessively high, focusing instead on more minor matters, those less likely to draw direct scrutiny. Furthermore, she began to cultivate an image of simplicity and superstition, portraying herself as someone who believed in folk remedies and ancient tales, lacking any genuine comprehension of the plantation's power dynamics. She would occasionally utter remarks that sounded naive or confused, pose questions suggesting a lack of understanding regarding decision-making processes, and present herself as an individual skilled with botanical matters but lacking broader intellectual acuity. This was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to diminish her perceived threat, and to a degree it was successful. Hall remained suspicious, but he could find no evidence to substantiate his misgivings, and in the absence of proof, he was unable to act. Nevertheless, the tension between them continued to escalate, and Marie understood that a confrontation was ultimately inevitable. The conflict escalated in September of 1840 when a situation emerged that Marie could not overlook, despite the significant personal peril her involvement would entail. Thomas Bumont, the attorney's son, had wedded Catherine Hartwell in the spring of 1840, a union that brought considerable social and financial advantages to the Beaumont family. The Hartwells stood as one of Vicksburg's most esteemed lineages, possessing influence in banking, cotton commerce, and state governance. This matrimonial alliance had been meticulously orchestrated, with both families investing substantial effort to ensure its seamless progression. However, by September, Thomas had begun to reveal his true disposition. He frequented the plantation with regularity, ostensibly to attend to his father's legal affairs, but also to evade the watchful eyes of his wife and her family in Vicksburg. During these visits, his attention was drawn to a young woman named Ruth, who assisted the cook in the main residence. Ruth, at 16 years of age, was the daughter of Hannah, who oversaw the household linens. She was a reserved and diligent young woman striving to remain inconspicuous, a tactic often adopted by enslaved girls who attracted unwanted notice from men in positions of authority. Yet Thomas's focused gaze proved difficult to elude. He started fabricating pretexts to be in the kitchen whenever Ruth was working. He would comment on her looks, pose inquiries unrelated to her duties, and touch her arm or shoulder in ways that appeared casual but were not. Hannah observed these interactions with mounting dread. She comprehended the implications of Thomas's interest. She knew Ruth had no recourse to refuse him without facing reprisal. She understood that if Thomas decided to act upon his desire, her ability to shield her daughter would be non-existent. In her desperation, she sought out Marie late one evening when the slave quarters were quiescent. "He's going to ruin her," Hannah stammered, tears coursing down her face. "I perceive it in his gaze, in his discourse. It is only a matter of time before he takes what he covets. And I am powerless. If I object, we shall both be sold. If Ruth resists, she will be punished. Please, Marie, I know you cannot stop him directly, but there must be something. There must be a means to safeguard her." Marie remained silent for a considerable duration, her mind meticulously weighing potential courses of action and their inherent risks. This endeavor differed from her previous interventions. It directly implicated the Bumont family, not merely overseers or business associates. It involved Thomas, a man of education, intellect, and considerable connections. The peril was exponentially amplified. However, she also recognized that inaction would lead to Ruth's suffering and render her own influence within the community hollow. Information and insight held value only when applied, even at a significant cost. "Relate to me all that you know of Thomas Bumont," Marie stated finally. "His habits, his associates, his financial dealings, his debts, his marriage, everything you have gathered while working within the house." Over the subsequent week, Hannah and other house slaves furnished Marie with a comprehensive portrayal of Thomas Beaumont's life. The intelligence they imparted was extensive. Thomas was 26 years old, ambitious, and driven to establish a reputation for himself in Mississippi politics. He viewed his legal practice as a launch pad for a political career, potentially securing a seat in the state legislature or even Congress in the long term. His marriage to Catherine Hartwell was integral to these aspirations. The Hartwell family possessed the wealth, connections, and social standing that Thomas required. Catherine's father, William Hartwell, was a banker with influence in Vicksburg and ties throughout the state. Her uncle served as a state senator. The marriage had been as much a strategic alliance as a romantic engagement. Yet Thomas was also encumbered by debts. He had made imprudent investments in a cotton speculation venture, the very scheme that had caused difficulties for his father. He had sustained gambling losses in Vicksburg. He was living beyond his means, maintaining a lifestyle that necessitated his father's financial support and the anticipation of eventually accessing the Hartwell family fortune. Most critically, Thomas had a reputation to uphold. He presented himself as a gentleman, a man of integrity and refinement, someone worthy of the Hartwell family's confidence and investment. Any scandal, any insinuation of impropriety could tarnish that image and jeopardize both his marriage and his political ambitions. Catherine's mother, Mrs. Hartwell, was known for her stringent moral principles and her keen regard for her family's standing. She had initially harbored reservations about Thomas, suspecting he was marrying Catherine for financial gain rather than affection, and she had made it clear that his conduct would be subject to her close observation. Marie assimilated all this information, contemplating it deeply, searching for points of leverage. She could not directly confront Thomas, that would be self-destructive. She could not apprise Catherine of his intentions toward Ruth, as a slave's testimony would be discounted against a white man's denial, She could not even guarantee that Ruth would never be alone with Thomas, as he possessed the authority to summon her presence at his whim. However, she could subtly inform Thomas that his actions were under scrutiny, and that such observations might reach individuals capable of damaging his reputation and his future prospects. The strategy she devised was more intricate and perilous than any she had previously undertaken. It demanded precise timing, numerous intermediaries, and a profound grasp of the social networks interconnecting the planter class. Marie commenced by ensuring Ruth was never placed in a situation where Thomas could approach her without witnesses. She orchestrated a change in Ruth's work schedule, arranging for her to be consistently present in the kitchen when others were around, thereby preventing solitary encounters with Thomas in secluded areas. This adjustment was presented as a measure to enhance operational efficiency. It was argued that Ruth could acquire more knowledge by working alongside experienced cooks, and that the presence of multiple individuals in the kitchen during busy periods would accelerate workflow. Those who shared concerns about Thomas's behavior acquiesced to the change without excessive questioning. Yet, Marie understood this was merely a temporary safeguard. Thomas would eventually find another opportunity or simply compel Ruth to meet him privately. She needed to engineer a scenario where Thomas would autonomously conclude that pursuing Ruth posed too great a risk. The linchpin was Mrs. Hartwell, Catherine's mother. If Mrs. Hartwell became apprehensive regarding Thomas's character, if she began to monitor his conduct more vigilantly, and if she made it unequivocally clear to Thomas that any scandal would carry repercussions, then Thomas might reconsider his actions. But how could Marie, an enslaved woman with no direct access to the Hartwell family, influence Mrs. Hartwell's perceptions? The solution lay within the complex web of social connections that bound plantation families across the region. Information flowed ceaselessly through these channels: gossip, rumors, observations, anxieties. If Marie could introduce the appropriate intelligence into these networks, it would eventually reach Mrs. Hartwell through seemingly organic avenues. Marie learned that Mrs. Hartwell intended to visit Natchez in October to attend a series of social gatherings. She would be lodging with the Chambers family, proprietors of a plantation approximately 10 miles from Bumont. Marie began to cultivate a relationship with a slave named Peter, who was employed by the Chambers family. She accomplished this by dispatching herbs and remedies to the Chambers plantation, positioning herself as a resource for medical assistance. Peter, who suffered from persistent headaches, became a regular recipient of Marie's fever-reducing concoctions. In return, he started to share insights into the Chambers household. Through Peter, Marie gained knowledge of the social events Mrs. Hartwell would attend, the other families expected to be present, and the likely topics of conversation. Subsequently, she commenced planting seeds of information that would germinate into concerns about Thomas Beaumont's character. She initiated this by engaging in casual discussions with Peter about plantation life, about the challenges faced by those who served families with young men who occasionally displayed inappropriate interest in enslaved women. She never explicitly mentioned Thomas, nor did she make direct accusations, but rather offered general observations regarding certain young men of the planter class who harbored habits that their wives' families might find troubling if they were aware of them. Peter, grasping the implicit meaning, began to engage in similar conversations with other slaves within the Chambers household. These discussions, filtered through several individuals, eventually reached the Chambers family's house slaves, who relayed the information in the circumspect and indirect manner that house slaves learned to employ when communicating with their enslavers. Mrs. Chambers, who was hosting Mrs. Hartwell and wished to ensure her guests' comfort and well-being, casually remarked that she hoped Thomas Beaumont was treating Catherine with kindness mentioning that she had heard whispers of some young men in the vicinity having reputations less honourable than they presented. Mrs. Hartwell, already protective of her daughter and somewhat distrustful of Thomas, inquired about the nature of Mrs. Chambers's information. Chambers, hesitant to make specific allegations without substantiation, stated only that she had encountered vague apprehensions, nothing concrete, and likely nothing to cause undue worry. However, she suggested that perhaps Mrs. Hartwell might wish to observe Thomas more closely during her visit, simply to confirm he was indeed the man he purported to be. This seemingly innocuous conversation instilled a seed of doubt in Mrs. Hartwell's mind. She began to pay closer attention to Thomas's behaviour, to solicit inquiries from Catherine regarding their marital relationship, and to observe Thomas's interactions with others. Concurrently, Marie pursued an alternative avenue. She had discovered that Thomas had been observed at a gambling establishment in Natchez on multiple occasions, incurring financial losses he could ill afford. This information originated from slaves working in Natchez, who witnessed occurrences that white society presumed were beyond their notice. Marie ensured this intelligence also permeated the social network, again through indirect channels. A slave employed at the gambling house mentioned to a slave working for a merchant family that he had seen Thomas Bumont there on several instances, engaging in high-stakes betting. This information, passed through a series of conversations, eventually reached the Chambers family, who then conveyed it to Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell, now genuinely concerned, dispatched a letter to her husband in Vicksburg, expressing her disquiet regarding Thomas's character and his treatment of their daughter. William Hartwell, who had committed considerable resources to Thomas's professional advancement and anticipated a return on that investment, determined it was imperative to have a serious discussion with his son-in-law concerning expectations and conduct. That conversation, coupled with Mrs. Hartwell's heightened scrutiny, made Thomas acutely aware that his actions were being monitored and that any scandal could jeopardize all that he had striven to achieve. Simultaneously, Marie arranged for Thomas to become cognizant that his interest in Ruth had been noted. She orchestrated this through a carefully staged overheard conversation as Thomas passed through the kitchen. Hannah was speaking with other enslaved individuals, voicing her apprehension regarding Ruth's safety and mentioning that she had observed one of the Bumont family members paying undue attention to her daughter. The conversation was sufficiently audible for Thomas to overhear, yet not so loud as to appear deliberately staged. It was presented as a private exchange between concerned women, the kind of discourse that occurred routinely in the quarters, but which white men seldom overheard. Thomas, upon hearing this, realized that his pursuit of Ruth was not as imperceptible as he had assumed. If the enslaved individuals were discussing it, there existed a risk that this information could reach his wife, his in-laws, or the broader social circle that shaped his reputation. The confluence of increased vigilance from his mother-in-law, the realization that his conduct was under observation, and the spectre of scandal compelled Thomas to re-evaluate his intentions. He began to avoid the kitchen during Ruth's working hours, to redirect his focus toward his legal responsibilities and his political aspirations, and to project the image of the honorable gentleman he claimed to be. Ruth, never aware of the complex web of information and influence that had been so intricately woven around her, found that Thomas's attention had been diverted elsewhere. She remained safe, continuing her work in the kitchen, oblivious to the precipice she had narrowly avoided and unaware of the individual who had provided her protection. However, Marie's intervention did not go unnoticed by Cyrus Holt. He could not precisely ascertain the methods employed. The information was too dispersed, having passed through too many individuals and been filtered through too many conversations. Yet, he understood that something had transpired, something that had shielded Ruth from Thomas's advances, and he suspected Marie was at the heart of it. He had been observing Marie for months, seeking evidence of malfeasance, and this situation solidified his suspicions. She was excessively astute, too well connected, and far too influential. He believed she was manipulating circumstances in ways that undermined the plantation's established hierarchy, rendering her a danger. In November of 1840, Holt initiated his action. He accused Marie of practicing sorcery, of employing supernatural means to influence events on the plantation. This was a grave accusation, one that could result in severe punishment or even execution. The accusation stemmed partly from superstition. Holt genuinely believed that Marie's influence was somehow unnatural, that no enslaved person could possess the cunning to achieve what he suspected her of doing without some form of supernatural aid. However, it was also rooted in calculation. Accusations of witchcraft were notoriously difficult to refute and carried severe penalties. If Holt could substantiate his claim, he could eliminate Marie as a threat. The accusation was brought before Charles Bumont, who was legally obligated to investigate any allegations of witchcraft or insurrection among the enslaved population. Such accusations were taken with considerable seriousness in the South, where the fear of slave revolts was pervasive and where any hint of supernatural influence was perceived as potentially perilous. Marie was summoned to the main house on a chilly November morning, standing before Bumont and Holt in the library, a room where countless decisions impacting her life and the lives of others had been rendered. The walls were lined with books, symbols of knowledge and authority, representations of the education and dominion that the planter class asserted as their exclusive prerogative. Charles Bumont sat behind his desk, his expression toward Marie inscrutable. He was an intelligent and educated man, capable of rational thought. Yet he was also a product of his era and environment, raised with the conviction that enslaved individuals were inherently inferior, incapable of the sophisticated reasoning that Marie had demonstrably displayed. "These are serious charges," Bumont stated, his voice solemn. "Mr. Holt alleges that you have employed unnatural methods to influence events on this plantation. He asserts that occurrences transpire around you that defy conventional explanation, that you possess knowledge you should not have, and that you manipulate outcomes in ways suggesting supernatural power. What is your response to these allegations?" Marie kept her gaze lowered, her posture deferential, her voice subdued. She had anticipated this moment, knowing it would eventually arrive. The subsequent few minutes would determine everything. "Sir, I am a practitioner of herbal remedies," she stated deliberately. "I cultivate plants and prepare remedies as I was instructed upon my arrival at this plantation. I am aware of which herbs alleviate fevers, which provide pain relief, and which can be fashioned into poultices for wounds. My grandmother imparted these teachings to me in my youth, and I have applied them throughout my life. However, I possess no knowledge of witchcraft or any unnatural arts. I merely perform the duties assigned to me." "Holt claims individuals seek you out for more than just remedies," Bumont continued. "He states that you offer counsel, that circumstances change after they speak with you, that you appear to possess knowledge beyond your station, that you influence events that should be beyond your capacity. People confide in me, sir." "Yes," Marie admitted. "They share their tribulations much as individuals do when they are unwell or in pain. When the body suffers, the mind is also troubled, and sometimes people require the solace of conversation regarding their anxieties as much as they need medicine. I listen because listening is integral to healing. My grandmother also taught me this." "And do you offer them advice?" Bumont inquired. "On occasion, sir. if they solicit it. But only straightforward counsel, the sort that anyone might offer. If someone fears being accused of an offence, I might suggest they speak with the overseer and present their perspective. If someone is concerned about a family member, I might advise them to speak with you or Mrs. Bumont if the matter is grave. I hold no power to effect any change myself. I am merely an enslaved woman who tends to plants and listens to people's afflictions. It was a perfectly crafted response, humble, sensible, and irrefutable. She presented herself as an individual possessing expertise in a limited domain, yet lacking comprehension of broader power structures, an individual who offered only the most rudimentary advice that any person might extend. Holt's countenance contorted with frustration. "She is fabricating," he declared. "She is manipulating individuals. She possesses knowledge she should not have. She influences matters beyond her capacity. She is far too astute." "Being astute is not tantamount to practicing witchcraft," Bumont remarked mildly. "Intelligence is not supernatural." "But she is enslaved, Mr. Holt," Marie interjected. "Enslaved individuals are not expected to possess such intelligence." Bumont regarded him with an expression that conveyed his skepticism of this assertion. "I have encountered numerous intelligent enslaved individuals, Mr. Holt. Intelligence is not confined to any specific race or condition." Marie clearly possesses intelligence and she is demonstrably skilled in her work, but that does not imply she practices witchcraft. He then turned back to Marie. "Do you read and write?" It was a perilous question. Literacy for enslaved individuals was prohibited in Mississippi. An admission of this capability could result in punishment, but a denial, when Bumont might already possess evidence to the contrary, would be equally hazardous. "I can decipher some, sir," Marie admitted cautiously. "My previous enslaver in Louisiana permitted it so that I could read receipts for herb orders and maintain records of remedies. I am aware that it is not permitted here, and I have instructed no one else. I utilize this skill solely for my work, to keep track of my inventory of plants and the remedies I have prepared. I can make notations to aid my memory, sir. I am uncertain if that constitutes proper writing." Bumont nodded slowly. He opened a desk drawer and retrieved Marie's leather journal, the one she kept concealed in her cabin. Marie's heart plummeted. Someone had searched her belongings and discovered it. "This belongs to you?" Bumont inquired, holding up the journal. "Yes, sir." "What does it contain?" "Recipes for remedies, sir. Notes regarding which plants thrive together, which require more water or sunlight. Matters my grandmother taught me that I wished to retain." Bumont opened the journal and examined its pages. Marie had been meticulous in her entries. The journal did indeed contain recipes and plant notations precisely as she had stated, but it also held observations concerning the plantation's operations, patterns she had discerned, and insights into individuals and their relationships. She had encoded these observations, employing plant names and horticultural metaphors to obscure their true import. To an uninitiated reader, it would appear as nothing more than the notations of an herbalist. However, to someone possessing the key to her cipher, it would reveal the sophisticated intelligence network Marie had meticulously constructed. Bumont perused several pages, his brow furrowed in contemplation. Marie remained uncertain whether he grasped the content or merely saw botanical notations. At length, he closed the manuscript and placed it on his desk. "I find no indication of sorcery here," he declared. "These are merely observations concerning flora and their medicinal applications, precisely as Marie indicated. She possesses literacy and keen intellect, qualities that render her indispensable in her capacity as a domestic assistant. Provided she continues to fulfill her obligations and avoids causing overt disruption, I see no grounds for chastisement." He turned to Holt. "Your concerns have been duly noted, Mr. Holt, but I shall not act solely on conjecture. Should you possess tangible proof of malfeasance, evidence of sedition, larceny, or deliberate sabotage, present it to me and I shall take action. However, intelligence and erudition are not offences, and I will not penalize a valuable enslaved person for exhibiting astuteness." This was a temporary reprieve, yet Marie comprehended it was also a caution. Bumont had, in essence, informed her that he was aware of her clandestine activities, or at least harbored suspicions, and that he would tolerate them only as long as they did not directly jeopardize his interests. A boundary had been established, and transgressing it would incur repercussions. "You may resume your duties, Marie," Bumont instructed, "but understand that you are under observation. Should I have cause to believe you are precipitating trouble, my leniency will be considerably diminished." "Yes, sir," Marie replied softly. "Thank you, sir." She departed the study, her journal still resting on Beaumont's desk. She made no request for its return, deeming it too audacious. A new journal would be necessary, demanding even greater circumspection regarding its contents and safekeeping. Nevertheless, she had weathered the confrontation, and that was paramount. Marie subsequently refined her strategies. She became even more discreet, more judicious in her timing and methods of intervention. Her focus shifted to scenarios where the outcome would benefit the enslaved populace without directly imperiling the plantation's operations or the Bumont family's welfare. She also began to impart her techniques to others, instructing them in observation, information acquisition, and the subtle dissemination of influence. This endeavor was conducted with utmost care, collaborating with individuals in whom she placed absolute trust, those who fully apprehended the risks and possessed the intellect and perseverance to apply these methods effectively. Denina became one such protégé, learning to glean intelligence from the main house and relay it through dependable conduits. Hannah acquired the skill of discerning patterns in the Bumont family's conduct and anticipating their decisions. Peter, situated on the Chambers plantation, evolved into a crucial link within an expansive network connecting enslaved individuals across numerous estates in the vicinity. Marie was cultivating something far grander than herself, a framework capable of enduring even if she were to be sold, punished, or perish. She was instilling the understanding that intellect and information were potent implements, that resistance did not invariably manifest as outright revolt, and that authority could be challenged through circumspect means, leaving no discernible trace. Yet her aspirations expanded further. She contemplated freedom, not escape, a perilous and often unsuccessful undertaking that abandoned those unable to flee. Instead, she envisioned legal emancipation achieved through the very instruments provided by the existing societal structure. Marie had ascertained that legal avenues existed by which enslaved individuals could, on occasion, procure their liberty or be granted manumission by their proprietors. These processes, though infrequent and difficult to access, were nonetheless viable. In Louisiana, the legal statutes offered a degree of flexibility absent in Mississippi. Individuals of color who were free possessed the right to own property, manage enterprises, and even hold enslaved persons themselves. New Orleans and other urban centers boasted communities of free black individuals who had attained their freedom through various means and often extended assistance to others seeking the same. Marie commenced gathering intelligence pertaining to these procedures, their requisite legal stipulations, associated expenditures, and potential facilitators. This information was procured through the network she had established Through discussions with enslaved individuals who maintained connections with free black communities, and through meticulous observation of legal parchments casually left in the library by Thomas Bumont. Concurrently, she began to envision pathways to achieving freedom, not solely for herself, but for others as well. In the year 1841, Marie became aware that Charles Bumont was experiencing considerable financial distress. The cotton market had endured a period of instability for several years, with prices exhibiting volatile fluctuations contingent upon factors beyond the planter's control, such as meteorological conditions, international commerce, and speculative ventures by cotton merchants. Bumont had undertaken investments predicated on the assumption of sustained high prices, but instead prices had plummeted, leaving him burdened with accumulating debts that were becoming increasingly challenging to manage. Marie acquired this knowledge through multiple channels. She overheard conversations between Charles and Eleanora Bumont, privy to house slaves who subsequently disseminated the information through the network. She observed correspondence from creditors while attending to the library. She heard Thomas discussing his father's fiscal predicament with Catherine during one of their visits. The gravity of the situation was such that Bumont was contemplating divesting some of his enslaved populace to generate capital. This presented a crisis for the entire community, as sales invariably led to familial separations and the displacement of individuals to plantations with potentially harsher conditions. The network that Marie had meticulously constructed was thrown into disarray. Marie commenced systematically gathering intelligence regarding Bumont's financial standing with unwavering precision. She identified his creditors by name, quantified his liabilities, and ascertained payment deadlines. She familiarized herself with his assets, including his land holdings and business partnerships. She delved into the intricacies of the cotton market, analyzing prices and trends, and discerning the reliability of various brokers. This comprehensive data was amassed from dozens of sources, conversations overheard by household staff, documents glimpsed by those responsible for maintaining the library and plantation office, casual remarks by plantation visitors, and intelligence relayed by enslaved individuals from other estates connected to the network. Subsequently, she sought avenues for leverage, seeking means to assist Bumont in resolving his financial difficulties without resorting to the sale of enslaved persons. She discovered that one of Bumont's principal creditors, a banker in Natchez named Sutton, had recently become embroiled in a scandal concerning fraudulent land transactions. While the scandal had not yet surfaced publicly, whispers of it were circulating within specific business circles. Sutton had allegedly engaged in the sale of properties to investors who lacked the diligence to verify titles, either because he did not possess legitimate ownership or because the titles were encumbered. Numerous individuals had sustained financial losses, and discussions of legal recourse were prevalent. Marie also ascertained that Sutton was exceptionally keen on preserving his reputation and would therefore be susceptible to pressure from any party threatening to expose his illicit dealings. However, Marie was unable to leverage this information directly, lacking any standing or voice within the commercial sphere. It was imperative to ensure that this intelligence reached an individual possessing such standing, someone motivated to act upon it against Sutton. She identified a rival banker in Natchez, a Mr. Prescott, who had been vying for influence in the region with Sutton. Prescott was characterized by his ambition, ruthlessness, and constant pursuit of opportunities to undermine his competitors. Through a convoluted communication chain involving numerous intermediaries, Marie orchestrated the transmission of information regarding Sutton's fraudulent activities to Prescott. The intelligence was presented as a rumor purportedly overheard by an enslaved individual employed within Sutton's household, subsequently relayed through the informal communication channels connecting enslaved persons across various plantations and businesses. The process unfolded as follows. Marie apprised Peter, employed at the Chambers plantation, of rumors circulating about questionable land transactions in Natchez. Peter, in turn, mentioned this to an enslaved individual working for a merchant family in Natchez. That individual relayed the information to another enslaved person employed in Sutton's household, inquiring about the veracity of these rumors. The latter, having indeed encountered documents pertinent to the fraudulent sales, confirmed the apparent irregularities in some of Sutton's land dealings. This confirmation traversed the communication chain, its credibility escalating with each retelling. Ultimately, the information reached a free black gentleman in Natchez possessing business affiliations with Prescott's bank. This individual, perceiving an advantageous opportunity to curry favor with Prescott, conveyed the rumors to one of Prescott's associates. Prescott initiated an investigation into the rumors and discovered them to be substantiated. He then recognized a dual opportunity to discredit his rival and expand his own commercial reach. He approached several of Sutton's clients, including Charles Bumont, with a proposition. He would extend loans on favorable terms to enable them to settle their outstanding debts to Sutton, in return for their commitment to transfer their banking business to Prescott's institution. Beaumont, seizing an opportunity to extricate himself from his financial predicament without disposing of his enslaved laborers, accepted the offer. Prescott provided a loan that facilitated Beaumont's repayment of his debts. In reciprocation, Beaumont pledged to utilize Prescott's bank for future transactions and to grant Prescott a share in the forthcoming cotton harvest. The crisis was thus averted. The enslaved populace at Beaumont Plantation remained intact. No families were subjected to separation, and no one, with the exception of Marie, was aware that she had orchestrated the entire sequence of events. She had identified the crucial leverage point, constructed the communication network, and ensured the timely delivery of the appropriate information to the designated recipient. To all others, it appeared merely a matter of fortuitous timing and competitive business practices. Over the subsequent 3 years, from 1841 to 1844, Marie continued her work with escalating sophistication. She intervened in numerous situations, safeguarding individuals, preventing separations, and mitigating punishments. She attained legendary status within the enslaved community, not only at Beaumont but across the region, as word of her methods spread through the interconnected networks linking the plantations. Concurrently, she began to direct her influence toward a more ambitious objective, facilitating freedom. Marie had learned that several mechanisms existed by which enslaved individuals could achieve legal emancipation. Firstly, manumission by the owner, wherein the proprietor voluntarily liberated an enslaved person, typically in acknowledgement of prolonged service or extraordinary circumstances. This was uncommon but not unprecedented. Secondly, self-purchase, whereby an enslaved person permitted to accumulate earnings could acquire their own freedom. This necessitated the owner's consent and was viable only in states such as Louisiana, where the legal framework permitted it. Thirdly, purchase by a free person of color, where an individual already emancipated would acquire an enslaved person with the intention of subsequently freeing them. This was occasionally undertaken by relatives or by free black communities dedicated to assisting enslaved individuals in attaining freedom. Fourthly, legal challenges predicated on technicalities within ownership or sales documentation. This was rare and arduous, but on occasion an individual would discover that their enslavement was legally questionable and could contest it in court. Marie began identifying individuals who might be amenable to freedom through one of these avenues. She sought out those possessing skills that rendered them sufficiently valuable for an owner to consider permitting self-purchase. She identified individuals with connections to free black communities in Louisiana or other states. She looked for individuals whose enslavement might present legal vulnerabilities. Subsequently, she began to engineer situations where freedom became a tangible possibility. For a man named Daniel, endowed with exceptional carpentry abilities, Marie arranged for him to undertake work for several prominent families in Natchez. This endeavor fostered a reputation that made him valuable enough that Bumont might consider allowing him to purchase his freedom. She accomplished this by discreetly mentioning his skills to household enslaved individuals who served those families, who in turn relayed this information to their employers, prompting requests for Daniel's services to Bumont. Daniel's craftsmanship was so impressive that several families offered premium compensation for his labor. Bumont, recognizing a profitable opportunity, began to hire Daniel out frequently, permitting Daniel to retain a small portion of his earnings. Over several years, Daniel amassed sufficient funds to propose the purchase of his freedom. Bumont, by this juncture having stabilized his financial standing and perceiving Daniel as more valuable as a free artisan who could be engaged as needed rather than as an enslaved individual requiring maintenance, acceded to the transaction. Daniel attained his freedom in the year 1843 at the age of 35. For a woman named Esther, who had diligently saved funds from cultivating vegetables in her garden plot, Marie facilitated her navigation of the legal process of manumission. This was achieved by ensuring that information regarding the procedure reached her through a free black woman in Natchez who had established connections with attorneys willing to handle such matters. Esther had been accumulating funds for years, selling produce and eggs to fellow enslaved individuals and occasionally to white families in the vicinity. She had amassed nearly $200, a substantial sum, yet she was unaware of how to approach Bumont regarding the purchase of her freedom, nor did she understand the legal requirements or even if such a possibility existed. Marie arranged for Esther to meet with the free black woman whose name was Hala during a visit to Natchez for the purpose of selling vegetables. Hala elucidated the legal process, connected Esther with legal counsel capable of drafting the requisite documents, and assisted her in formulating a proposal to present to Bumont. The proposal was meticulously crafted to appeal to Beaumont's financial interests. Esther offered not only the $200 she had saved, but also a commitment to continue supplying the plantation with vegetables at reduced prices for the ensuing 5 years. The total value of the proposition approximated $400, a reasonable sum for a woman of Esther's age and capabilities. Bumont, who was in a more secure financial position by the year 1844 and who valued Esther's consistent service, consented to the manumission. Esther became a free woman, though she continued to reside in the locality and maintain her associations with the enslaved community. Each case demanded months, if not years, of meticulous effort. Nevertheless, gradually, individuals began to achieve freedom through legal channels that left no discernible trace of Marie's involvement. By the year 1844, Marie herself had accumulated sufficient funds from the sale of herbs and remedies to contemplate her own emancipation. She had been permitted to retain a modest portion of the revenue generated from selling remedies to white families in the region, amassing nearly $300 over a period of 5 years. However, she also recognized that her value to the community resided in her position at Bumont, where she had access to critical information and exerted influence. Departure would necessitate abandoning the network she had cultivated and the individuals she had protected. It presented a dichotomy between personal liberation and collective empowerment, a choice that, for an extended period, Marie found difficult to resolve. The decision was, however, made for her in the spring of 1845, when Cyrus Hall, who had persistently harbored suspicions of Marie's subversive activities, finally unearthed evidence he believed could be used against her. One of Marie's couriers, a man named Benjamin, responsible for transmitting messages between plantations, was apprehended with a letter containing information pertaining to slave sales and plantation finances. Benjamin's role as a driver, facilitating the transportation of goods between estates, provided him with legitimate justifications for travel and made him an invaluable intermediary for the network. However, in March of 1845, he was intercepted by a patrol actively seeking runaway slaves. The patrol conducted a search of his wagon, discovering the letter concealed amongst his possessions. The missive employed coded language, utilizing plant metaphors similar to those found in Marie's journal, yet it was sufficiently comprehensible to reveal information concerning business dealings that an enslaved person should not have possessed. Under interrogation, Benjamin divulged that he had been gathering intelligence at Marie's behest, though he asserted ignorance regarding its ultimate purpose or her motivations. Hall, having long awaited concrete evidence against Marie, perceived this as his opportune moment. He presented the letter and Benjamin's testimony to Bumont, alleging that Marie was orchestrating an intelligence network amongst the enslaved population, accumulating information that could be utilized for insurrection or escape. This time, Bumont could not dismiss the accusation. The evidence was too substantial, the implications too grave. The letter demonstrably indicated that Marie was collecting information regarding plantation finances and slave sales, data she had no legitimate right to access. Benjamin's testimony further corroborated that Marie was directing this intelligence-gathering operation. Marie was subsequently arrested and confined to the plantation jail, while Bumont deliberated her fate. A profound sense of dread permeated the enslaved community. Marie had been their protector, their strategist, their beacon of hope. In her absence, they would be exposed to the full force of the plantation's hierarchical power structure. Those who had relied on her counsel, those she had rescued through her interventions, those who had absorbed her methodologies, all feared the impending consequences. Yet Marie had anticipated this eventuality. Throughout the years, she had diligently trained others in her techniques, instructing them in observation, information acquisition, and the subtle planting of influence. She had established a network capable of functioning independently of her, albeit with diminished efficacy, and she possessed one final stratagem. From her confinement in the plantation jail, Marie dispatched a message through the network she had meticulously constructed. This communication was conveyed by Denina, who had been among Marie's most trusted pupils. It reached Thomas Beaumont in Vicksburg, where he had established himself as a successful legal practitioner with burgeoning political aspirations. The message contained crucial information pertaining to a case Thomas was actively pursuing, a complex property dispute that had remained unresolved for months. One of Thomas's clients was striving to establish ownership of a parcel of land that had been transacted multiple times under ambiguous titles. The resolution of the case hinged upon the discovery of documentation substantiating the chain of ownership, but such documentation had been conspicuously absent. Marie's network had ascertained the location of this concealed documentation. It was held by the attorney representing the opposing party, who had deliberately withheld it to impede the progress of Thomas's client's claim. The message provided Thomas with precise details regarding the whereabouts of the documents and the legal means by which to obtain them via a court order. Accompanying this intelligence was a proposition if Thomas would intercede on Marie's behalf, arguing for her considerable value and suggesting her transfer to a more accommodating proprietor in Louisiana rather than severe punishment, the detailed information concerning the documents would be furnished. Should he decline, the information would be irrevocably destroyed, leaving his case in limbo and potentially resulting in a setback that could tarnish his reputation. This was unequivocally blackmail. However, it was blackmail framed as an exchange of value rather than a threat of harm. Thomas stood to gain a tangible benefit, a significant legal victory poised to enhance his standing in return for a relatively minor concession. Thomas, driven by ambition and practicality, recognized the advantageous nature of this proposition. He also understood that Marie represented a formidable intelligence and a significant threat, making her continued presence in Mississippi untenable, where she might persist in creating difficulties for the planter class. Relocating her to Louisiana with its distinct legal framework and the potential for eventual freedom would effectively neutralize the threat while simultaneously offering a benefit to his father. He journeyed to Bumont plantation and presented his case to his father. He articulated that Marie's intelligence and value were indeed too significant to be squandered through punitive measures. Her execution or sale to a cruel master would represent a substantial loss of valuable property. Rather than enduring further complications on the plantation, Charles Bumont was persuaded by Thomas's proposition to sell Marie to a contact in New Orleans. This contact was Helen, a free black woman who managed a boarding house and required someone with Marie's particular abilities. This arrangement promised greater financial returns and would remove the source of persistent issues from the estate. Bumont, weary of the predicaments Marie had created and recognizing the financial prudence in Thomas's logic, consented. Consequently, Marie was sold to Helen in New Orleans for $1,000, a sum reflecting her considerable skills and intellect. The transaction concluded in June of 1845. Marie's departure from the plantation meant leaving behind the established network she had fostered, the individuals she had safeguarded, and the community that had come to rely on her. Yet she also left behind something even more significant: a methodology, a distinct way of thinking, and a collection of techniques that others could implement. The network she had built persisted after her absence, functioning with diminished efficacy, but remaining intact, continuing to gather intelligence, sow seeds of influence, and engage in resistance that left no discernible trace. Marie arrived in New Orleans in late June of 1845, marking a complete transformation of her life. The city presented a stark contrast to her experiences in Mississippi. It was more expansive, considerably more diverse, boasting a substantial population of free people of color who independently operated businesses, maintained their own communities, and wielded their own forms of influence. Helen, the free black woman who had acquired her, was an integral part of a network of free black individuals dedicated to assisting enslaved people in attaining their freedom through lawful channels. The purchase itself had been meticulously orchestrated to extricate Marie from Mississippi and place her in circumstances that would ultimately enable her to purchase her own liberty. Helen presided over a boarding house in the French Quarter, catering to both free people of color and white patrons comfortable with the city's more fluid racial dynamics. She needed someone with Marie's aptitudes to oversee the domestic arrangements, administer to the medical needs of the boarders, and assist in the general management of the establishment. The agreement was unambiguous from the outset. Marie would work for Helen, earning a salary that would facilitate her accumulation of funds towards her emancipation. The agreed-upon price was $1,000, the sum Helen had paid for her, augmented by interest. While it would require time, the objective was attainable. Marie immersed herself in her duties with the same systematic diligence that characterized all her endeavors. She managed the boarding house, provided care for ailing boarders, cultivated an herb garden in the courtyard, and commenced forging new connections within New Orleans. Furthermore, she continued the clandestine work she had undertaken in Mississippi, albeit within a new setting. New Orleans harbored a significant population of both enslaved individuals and free people of color, presenting continuous opportunities to guide individuals toward freedom. Marie began establishing ties with other free people of color who were striving for analogous objectives. She encountered legal practitioners specializing in manumission cases. She met formerly enslaved individuals who had secured their freedom and were now actively assisting others in achieving the same. She connected with advocates engaged in the legal system to broaden the rights afforded to free people of color. Concurrently, she began meticulously documenting the strategies she had refined over the years, the observational skills, intelligence-gathering methods, and strategic influence techniques that had enabled her to protect individuals and facilitate their liberation. She committed these methods to a new journal, more comprehensive and methodical than the one previously confiscated by Bumont. Within its pages, she detailed how to analyze power structures, identify points of leverage, gather information discreetly, introduce information through trusted intermediaries, and effect change without leaving any incriminating evidence. She recounted specific instances, dissecting what had proven effective and what had not, and isolating principles applicable across diverse scenarios. She explored the psychology of power, elucidating how those in authority made decisions and how to subtly influence those decisions without direct confrontation. She discussed the construction and maintenance of networks and their utilization for disseminating and acquiring information. She deliberated on the nature of trust, how to cultivate and preserve it, and how to discern individuals capable of being entrusted with sensitive knowledge. She emphasized the virtue of patience, acknowledging that societal change often unfolded over months or years, and underscored the importance of sustaining hope and resolve when progress seemed unattainable. This journal evolved into a veritable handbook for resistance, a primer on employing intellect and information as instruments against oppression. Within 2 years, Marie had accumulated sufficient funds to purchase her freedom. She attained her liberty in 1847 at the age of 31. However, she did not cease her vital work. Instead, she amplified it. By leveraging the network she had established in Mississippi and her newfound connections in New Orleans, Marie became a key facilitator of freedom for others. She gathered intelligence on enslaved individuals suitable for manumission, connected them with sympathetic legal counsel and free black sponsors, and guided them through the intricate legal processes necessary for liberation. She also commenced disseminating her journal, transcribing sections and distributing them through her trusted networks. The journal circulated from person to person, repeatedly copied, and its methodologies adapted and applied in various contexts throughout the South. It became a clandestine instructional text for resistance, instructing individuals on how to wield intellect and information as weapons against the oppressive system. These methods spread, adapted, and evolved, becoming an integral part of the armamentarium enslaved people employed for resistance and survival. Marie Laveau resided in New Orleans for the remainder of her life, practicing as a healer and herbalist, but also serving as a discreet organizer and strategist for the cause of freedom. She never achieved the public renown of some abolitionists. Her methods necessitated discretion, and her effectiveness hinged on remaining in the background. Nevertheless, by the time of her passing in 1881, at the age of 65, she had facilitated the freedom of over 200 individuals through legal manumission. She had instructed dozens of others in her strategic resistance techniques and had established networks of information and influence that continued to function long after her death. The narrative of Marie Laveau, the enslaved woman from Mississippi, was deliberately obscured by subsequent historical accounts. The legend of the Voodoo Queen, which arose around a different Marie Laveau in New Orleans, a free woman of color who lived concurrently and did indeed practice voodoo, became the dominant interpretation, eclipsing the true story of the enslaved woman who utilized intelligence and information as tools for liberation. This obfuscation was not accidental. The Chronicle of Marie, the enslaved woman, posed a threat to the narratives America preferred to construct about slavery. It exposed the enslaved not as passive victims, but as active resistors employing sophisticated strategies to subvert the system that subjugated them. It demonstrated that resistance did not invariably manifest as overt rebellion, and that intellect and perseverance could be as potent as violence. It also unveiled uncomfortable truths regarding the nature of power, revealing its dependence on information and perception, and how those who controlled information could sway outcomes even without formal authority. Educational institutions omitted this account, preferring simpler narratives, that of helpless slaves awaiting white saviors, or that of violent rebellion as the sole recourse. Marie's story fit neither template. She was neither helpless nor prone to violence. She was strategic, patient, and remarkably effective. Her methods were preserved in that journal, surviving in fragmented forms across various archives. Its pages were dispersed among different collections, frequently misattributed or mislabeled. Certain passages were dismissed as apocryphal, relegated to the realm of folklore rather than historical fact. However, the techniques detailed within those pages, the systematic acquisition of information, the strategic dissemination of influence, the patient cultivation of networks, were authentic and were employed by countless individuals whose names remain unrecorded. Marie Laveau's legacy was not rooted in supernatural abilities or mystical practices. It resided in the demonstration that knowledge, judiciously applied, could dismantle systems of oppression from within, that intellect was a weapon, patience a strategy, and freedom could be achieved through incremental, deliberate interventions. The enslaved woman from Mississippi, Marie Laveau, grasped a truth that America has historically been reluctant to acknowledge, that the enslaved were not mere recipients of historical forces, but active agents who shaped history through methods that were subtle, sophisticated, and far more disruptive to the established order than any overt uprising. This is the very reason her story was excluded from textbooks, not because it lacked veracity, but because it was too true. And the truth it conveyed challenged every comfortable assumption about power, resistance, and the agency of individuals in shaping historical trajectories. The woman who tended to herbs in a Mississippi plantation garden and transformed the lives of hundreds through mere observation and strategic conversation was more revolutionary than any army and posed a greater threat to the system than any weapon. This is precisely why her narrative was deliberately excluded from educational curricula. The authentic Marie Laveau, the one history chose to erase, proved that the most potent form of resistance is often the one that leaves no visible mark, the one that operates within the existing framework to dismantle it internally, employing the oppressor's tools not for ostentatious destruction but to discreetly unlock doors and windows until the entire edifice becomes unsustainable. Her story serves as a potent reminder that history is authored by those who control the narrative, and that the most dangerous stories are often those systematically expunged. For if people comprehended that intellect and information could be wielded as weapons, that patience and strategy could achieve what violence could not, and that systems of oppression could be undermined from within by those perceived as powerless, then every such system would become vulnerable in ways that its architects could never fully counter. This is the narrative they eschewed from educational instruction, not for its falsehood, but for its profound truth. And truth, as ever, remains the most formidable entity.